The Gospel of Mark begins what is known as the section of the way in chapter 8 verse 34, which you will hear about in the Gospel text of today. This section of the way ends only at the end of chapter 10 verse 52, when we are told in that verse, blind Bartimaeus, who is healed, followed Jesus on the way. It is only in Mark that the phrase on the way is used to indicate that the way is now over, because in chapter 11 verse 1, the next verse, Jesus enters Jerusalem, his way is complete. So chapter 8 verse 34, which begins our text for today, also begins the section of the way. This section is called the section of the way for three reasons. The first is that in these verses and chapters up to the end of chapter 10, Jesus is constantly on the road. And he is on the road to Jerusalem, where he will suffer and die. The second reason why it is called the section of the way is because all the three passion and resurrection predictions within this section, chapter 8 verse 31, chapter 9 verse 31, chapter 10 verses 32 to 34 are all when Jesus is on the way. And the third reason why this section is called the section of the way is because in these verses, Jesus speaks about his way of life. And so today, we will hear in a summary form the way of life of Jesus. He begins by calling anyone who wants to be a disciple of his and says to that person that if they want to be a disciple, they must do two things. The first is they must deny themselves. The second is that they must take up the challenge of life and follow. What does this mean practically? The ego is something which all of us possess. And Freud spoke about the ego and the id and the superego. So some of us have such a large ego that we find it difficult to deny self. Ego in its full form means edging God out. And when I edge God out, other idols take the place of God. And those other idols are my ambition, my wealth, my riches, my talents, my qualities. And because of all of these, the greatest sin of all, my pride. Often when Jesus tells parables, he tells parables in which there is a person who is selfish and a person who is selfless. The rich man in Luke chapter 16 verses 19 to 31 is so caught up in himself, is so self-centered, is so selfish that he cannot see the poor Lazarus who sits at the feet of his table. The rich man in Luke chapter 12 who wants to build big barns because he has got so many crops is a man who's planning only about his abundance and not about sharing. And therefore, Jesus speaks about the danger of the riches in Mark chapter 10 verses 17 to 31. The rich man who comes to him and is unable to follow because he allowed his riches to possess him. And so, when Jesus invites those who wish to follow him to deny themselves, He is asking something tremendously challenging. However, he is also inviting every one of us to free ourselves. Our riches can take hold of us. Our possessions can take hold of us. Our talents and qualities can take hold of us and lead to that sin of pride. And Jesus is asking us not to edge God out, but to give God center place, to let God rule our minds and our hearts, to let God's will be what we will do as a regular course of life. It is only after this that a person can accept whatever challenges life throws at him or her. So Jesus is very strategic in his instructions. The instructions are first not to face the challenges of life, because if I face the challenges of life without denying myself, the danger is that the I will come in the way, that the ego will come in the way. However, if I keep the I aside, if I keep the ego aside, and then I face the challenges of life, then I accept whatever life throws at me, then I carry my cross courageously. Jesus goes on to speak a verse which tradition believes was the verse which St. Ignatius used to convert Francis Xavier to the Lord's way of life. What does it profit anyone if they gain the whole world but lose themselves? What can a person give in exchange for his or her life? There was a man who was at gunpoint, caught by a robber. And the robber said, your money or your life? And the man said, take my life. I need my money for my old age. This is how some of us respond. We are so caught up with our money. We are so caught up with our riches. We are so caught up with the ego that we find it difficult to let go. If we hear the Lord and realize that the freedom which we experience in giving up the ego is so enormous, we will wonder why we never did it a long time ago. And so today is an invitation from the Lord to renounce or to deny self, not to edge God out, but to let God take center place. And when God does take center place, then all the challenges of life become easy to face. All the crosses and burdens become light to bear. Will you, as a disciple of Jesus, deny yourself, take up your cross courageously, and follow?